Thanks for having
There
me.
we are. Hey.
All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak to your group this afternoon. And I just want to take a minute to, first off, thanks for that great introduction, and then to introduce myself. For those of you who are wondering, who is Rebecca Roth? I was a flight attendant and an international purser for about 30 years at the time of the terror attacks of 9/11. And I've been a conservative for many years, and up until recently, I considered myself to be a Republican as well. No longer do I consider that to be the case. I'm not a conspiracy nut, although I can be kind of crazy at times. What I found is not a conspiracy, and it is unfortunately a pretty ugly truth. I recently released my book called The Methodical Illusion. And if you're interested to read it, I know Mike is there with some autographed copies for you. And if you're maybe go home and you want to digest some of what I'm going to tell you, you can find it also on the methodicalillusion.com webpage. And there you can find a connection to Facebook if you have further questions. There's just a button to click on to follow me on Facebook. And I welcome you to do that. You can also email me directly from my website because a lot of people have a lot of questions after they read this book. Uh, I have been interviewed, like Mike said, with Mills Crenshaw in Salt Lake City, Kate Daly in St. George, or Daly, I'm not sure of the pronunciation. George Norrie at Coast to Coast AM, John B. Wells, Caravan to Midnight, lots of others. I'm doing lots of Skype uh, chats with people that are beginning to wake up to see there's something really wrong with our country. And I found one of the stones, one of the bricks in the wall, so to speak, or sometimes I refer to it as the elephant in the room. I ended my airline career in 2004. So I did spend some time flying after 9/11, and I really didn't look back at the event. I watched it just like lots of you did. I watched it, however, maybe a little bit closer because it really did affect my life. I was glued to the television set for about 10 days because I luckily had just gotten home from Europe the night before the 9/11 attacks, or what we know as an attack. Um, I had one of the most interesting careers I think a person could ever dream of, and I met lots of really incredible people, celebrities, sports stars, you name it. And around 2008 or so, I decided I would write a novel just for people to read and enjoy, and just a little story about what I always called life in the jet stream. And I started that, and you can see that actually on my webpage. The first three chapters of the book are on there. And you can see what happened when I hit this transition. At one point, relatively early on in this novel, I wanted to grab a Middle Eastern name for a gentleman, that character that I was going to introduce into the book. And having just believed the official story about what happened on 9/11, I thought, well, I'll just Google search those 19 Arab terrorists on 9/11, grab the first name from one and the last name from another, which is what I did. And up in front of my face popped a BBC article that stated that several of the suspected hijackers were still alive. And as I continued my search after that hammer hit me over the head, I found out that the Saudi government is actually suing or threatening to sue the United States government and the FBI for stealing the identity of several of the, we know them as the 19 Arab hijackers. Suspects, I guess we could call them, because in fact, I have found 10 of them are still alive. There are people in the intelligence community that have written and have told me that the other nine, if you can just prepare yourself for this, the other nine might be exactly what I was about to do. I was about to grab the first name off one character and the last name off another and create a fictitious person for a story. Now let that digest just for a second, because the thing that really shocked me of this whole thing was that some of these Saudi Arabian citizens were actually professional airline pilots. And they are still alive, and in fact, they're still flying. And just in case you don't know this, airline people, much like yourselves, have to also clear through customs and immigrations and show our passport. Now, can you imagine holding a passport with the name and the photo that was shown all around the world in every news agency around the world, every newspaper, every major magazine had this guy's picture? The Saudi government said that the United States FBI also included their home addresses in their native country as well, that these guys are trying to travel around for work because they're professional pilots, being condemned as being a terrorist at 9/11. And that really just totally shocked me. But as I continued to look, I kept getting more and more shocked. And I think you will too when you read the book, if you choose to read it, listen to some of the interviews that I've done. I literally put thousands of hours of research into this because I could not believe what I had discovered. And it was so horrific. When I got it all put together and wrote this book, it sat on my shelf for 2 years. This last year, at the anniversary of 9/11, I spent a few hours on a phone conversation with a New York firefighter who told me, when I asked him, of course, that the firefighters that were up inside those towers were had nothing left but some of their gear. Their breathing apparatus, sometimes they'd find an axe or a tool that they had in their hands. But the human body was completely disintegrated and gone. And that touched me so much that I literally got off the phone with this gentleman from New York and told my husband, you know that story I wrote? I got to make it public. And I got to do that for those 343 firefighters. And I set out to edit this incredible story and all of the details that I had found and discovered because I had not, just like everyone else, I had gotten all of my information by watching television news, reading the newspapers, and reading the magazines. I didn't know about a fraction of what I found. And I'm just like everyone else. I'm just an American citizen. I knew a lot more about the airline than most people did. I started searching through government documents and FBI interviews, tape recordings of the phone calls that were supposedly made. And I followed down such a lengthy and complicated rabbit hole. I thought, how in the world am I going to tell people about this without looking like a lunatic? Because there was so much going on. Some of you may not even know some of these things. I'm just going to touch on some of the stuff that I discovered while I was researching this, that the Pentagon had misplaced 2.3 trillion taxpayer dollars. The United States Pentagon was being investigated for this misplaced 2.3 trillion with a T that Donald Rumsfeld actually announced on September 10th that they were investigating, in fact, this misplaced money. There was also 240 billion with a B dollars worth of fraudulent gold bonds. They're called Brady bonds if you want to look them up online. And they were expiring the next day, September 12th, 2001. Those were actually put together by George H.W. Bush 10 years earlier. And they were a combination of fraudulent paper bonds and physical gold that had been stolen from the Soviet Union and collapsing their economy. Those, by the way, the paper certificates were held right in one of the targeted offices of Cantor Fitzgerald in one of the Twin Towers. So they're gone forever. And then I also kind of found out that Building 7, which I remember clearly looking at, watching it fall down, thinking, well, how'd they set the demolition that quickly? It fell down around 5:20 that afternoon, even though it hadn't been hit by any aircraft debris or any airplanes or anything else. Now, an interesting thing about Building 7 held the largest offices of the CIA outside of Langley, Virginia. They also held the evidence for the trials that were coming up the next month in October of 2001 for Enron. I think most of you probably are old enough to remember the Enron scandal and the politicians that were connected to it, and also the Global Crossing and WorldCom scandals or lawsuits, which were actually going to trial the following month in October of 2001. So, as I continued learning about all of these things that the TV and the media had never ever mentioned, and I paid real close attention to this, especially because as a flight attendant, a purser, and a airline professional, I had never been warned or told about a group called Al Qaeda, and I'd never heard of Osama bin Laden. And we briefed through that in our yearly training for suspected hijackers that the US government was pointing out to us. They usually showed us pictures of them, gave us their names, and told us what they were suspecting these terrorists or hijackers might try to do. There was never, ever a mention of Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. So when that happened, I couldn't believe that someone living in a cave in Afghanistan, is what I found out later, could actually control NORAD and the United States military. Those were my safety nets. Those were the safety nets of all of you as passengers as well. And I was just totally shocked those days to learn, as I continued to learn, how this guy did this with a satellite phone and a laptop from a cave in Afghanistan. And I just couldn't believe it. Over the years, I'd been friends with special operations military guys and ladies. And I knew that we had a pretty good military, and I had actually had military jets scrambled for aircraft that I was on as a working crew member. And I also knew that if anything should happen on any aircraft, that within 6 minutes, the United States military would in fact scramble fighter jets to get us escorted down to the ground, where the aircraft would then be liberated by a Delta Force or some hostage rescue type people, and the passengers and crew members, hopefully, would all be saved. So I was really just totally stunned to see this. However, I saw things that were told to us on the media that day that I knew were wrong. And one of those things was that cell phone calls were made from the airplanes, because cell phone calls at that time absolutely did not work over about 15 to 1,800 feet off the ground. That's real close to the ground. And yet they were saying that these cell phone calls were made from altitude, some as high as 39,000 feet. As they started to look into what the flight attendants and the pilots did, according to the FAA and the FBI and all the government documents that I was reading, and I also read some of the reports from CNN and other media that were put out at that time, then I started to see that the pilots and the flight attendants both never followed very, very strict FAA protocols for hijackings. We had step-by-step protocols to follow during a hijacking, and they had not been changed since 1970. We had code words to use and a step-by-step protocol to follow. So that very first flight that left Boston, that we were led to believe was hijacked that day, was American Airlines Flight 11. And the callers that called out, there were only two of them. And luckily for me, they were flight attendants, because that was my business. And out of nearly 100 passengers and crew members, only two people, the two flight attendants, made calls out that day. And each of those flight attendants were on the phone for about 27 minutes. And so what I was looking at was, well, what kind of phone were they on? One of them supposedly was on a cell phone, and the other one no one knew because she called reservations, and that was a line that they couldn't tell what was going on. So I looked really, really close at all the details, listening very carefully to everything that these two flight attendants were saying and what they were doing, and tried to figure out why were they not following the step-by-step set in stone FAA hijack protocol. Because what I started to hear was a rather cryptic message that I turned and eventually said to my husband, only a flight attendant would hear this message. And then I explained to him what I heard these flight attendants were actually saying. And so I want to share some of that with you because this is what I finally realized was really going on. And it was because my ears of a flight attendant heard the message that those people that were doing this didn't realize would be sent to a flight attendant's ears. And so they weren't scrubbed off and they weren't taken out of the media and they were left in the FBI transcripts. But Betty Ong, the very first flight attendant that we'll talk about, had been flying for, I believe, nearly a dozen years. And she reported that there was one hijacker. You'll remember that the media said that there was, like 4 or 5 hijackers on each plane. But she called in to a reservations office, which was crazy because just like you, we'd be on hold for 10 or 20 minutes. And it was a very dangerous thing for a flight attendant to make a phone call, and any type of phone, because if there were really a hijacker on, he wouldn't want his plans to be foiled. And if you got caught on a phone, any kind of phone, you probably would be killed. So I found it very odd that she would sit on the phone for 27 minutes when she shouldn't be on the phone at all. But she did report that it was just one hijacker, and she referred to him as a he. And I found that really unusual because it's very different than the official story. She also said right away that he had sprayed pepper spray or mace in business class and they couldn't breathe in business class. But if you spray pepper spray or mace or anything, even cheap perfume, in any class of an airplane that's pressurized, in an entire aircraft, including the pilots, the hijackers, the passengers, and the flight attendants, will be feeling the effects of that pepper spray or mace or smelling the cheap perfume. And what that told me right there was that that cabin was no longer pressurized, which meant they were no longer in the air. So what I had then was a 20-minute tag, because that's when those phone calls started taking place after she left Boston's Logan Airport. Now, I kept looking and listening real carefully because the pilots also had a protocol to follow, and they didn't follow their protocol either. But Betty Ong went on to say some things that I heard with my flight attendant ears. And if you're old enough to remember smoking on an airplane, you'll remember that smoke did not stop at row 15 or row 26. It went through the entire cabin, just like pepper spray or mace would if the aircraft were pressurized. And that, I kept listening to what else she was saying. And then Betty Ong said, he, again to the hijacker as one he stood upstairs. And there are no stairs in a Boeing 767 aircraft. They're only in the 747. But there are stairs in a hangar. And I know that because I've been in many large hangars for 747s and even C-5 transports when I did military airlift command flights in the early years of my career. And they also have stairs in almost every corner because there's offices upstairs. And then Betty Ong said something else. She said, we're the first. And they were the first of those 4 aircraft that we were led to believe were hijacked that day. But how would she know that unless someone had told her that? And now, a real hijacker would not sit and tell a flight attendant the details of the rest of the day. So he would also not allow her to sit on the phone and talk to someone at the company because sure enough, his hijacking plans would be foiled. And as a matter of protocol, she would not want to get caught being on that phone. So if a real hijacker was there, then she was acting in a very, very odd way. And so was the quote unquote hijacker that she referred to as a he. Then she went on to say to the reservations agent, she said, I don't know. I don't know, but we might be being hijacked. And I'm here to tell you that flight attendants that are on an aircraft that are hijacked would not have one doubt in their mind that they were being hijacked. And so when Betty Ong said, I don't know, but we might be being hijacked, I realized that something very unusual was going on, especially for a hijacking, because she was on the phone for 27 minutes. The hijacker didn't seem to care. And somebody on that plane told Betty Ong that they were the first airplane to be hijacked. She also went on to say something else that as a flight attendant, I heard with my flight attendant ears. She said, we've been hijacked, we're up in the air. And a hijacking only takes place in the air. So to say she was up in the air was unusual, to put it at the best. And I thought, well, that's an interesting thing to say that you're up in the air because a hijacking doesn't take place on the ground. Just so you know, if a hijacker were to come on the aircraft while we were parked at the ground and you were sitting there getting yourselves comfortable, and he stands up to one of the flight attendants and says, this is a hijacking, take me to Havana or to Cleveland. We would just blow the chutes, arm the doors, blow the chutes, and say, "Come this way," and get you off the airplane because we're parked at the gate, at the ground, on the ground. So the hijacking only takes place in the air. So when Betty Ong said, "We're up in the air," and I believe she said it 2 or 3 times, "We're up in the air. We're up in the air. We've been hijacked." I thought, well, that's a redundancy she wouldn't need to say. And in a hijacking, you'd want to get the most important information out in the fewest words possible, not using redundancies like trying to explain where you are in a hijacking. So the other flight attendant that called in, her name was Amy Sweeney. She'd been flying about a dozen years too, so she was very familiar with the protocol. She at least called in to a supervisor in Boston where she was based, and she also reported that only one hijacker was on board, and she again referred to him as a he. And not only did she refer to him as a he, but she had other bits of information like where he was sitting. She told her supervisor that she was sitting in the last row, a second to the last row of coach seats in the aircraft, in the passenger seats, alongside of Betty Ong. But Betty Ong had told us that she was sitting in the flight attendant jump seat that pulls down, unfolds at door 3R, which is the last row in coach by the tail on the right-hand side of the aircraft in her jump seat. So I saw 2 flight attendants telling us 2 different things about where they were. Now, in a hijacking, the protocols that if you were able to get any information out to anyone, you would want that information to be 150% correct, including where Betty Ong was sitting. And so the fact that these 2 girls were telling different stories led me to believe that they weren't on the airplane at all anymore because they weren't in a pressurized cabin. They talked about stairs and that the guy, the hijacker, stood upstairs. So I started to look again real close to what was going on. Amy Sweeney, the other flight attendant, told her supervisor that the hijacker was in fact sitting in the row 9 in seat B. Now, if a flight attendant were to give that kind of information to someone on the ground, you would want to be that 150% sure of who that was. Later on, Amy Sweeney called back on another phone call, which she was lucky to get it to connect, because if you ever use those airphones on the plane, they didn't work very well, and a cell phone absolutely wouldn't work. So she took the chances of apparently calling back, and she did, and she said, "Oh, I made a mistake. The hijacker was in 10B and he stabbed the guy in 9B. And I thought no flight attendant would make that mistake. And why would we not make that mistake? Because if you were sitting there in 9B, just make this personal. And I told the people on the ground, the Delta Force, that you were the hijacker. I made a mistake. And they came and liberate the aircraft once we get it on the ground. There's a chance that an innocent person such as yourself could be killed by the hostage rescue team because I made a mistake. That's a mistake a flight attendant absolutely would not make because our job is to keep you safe, not get you killed innocently. So when I saw that, I decided I'd take a little look at this guy in 9B that the flight attendant referred to as the hijacker. And lo and behold, if I didn't find that this guy in 9B, well, he was the elephant in the room. 9B was a Middle Eastern man. Yes, indeed, he was. He was also a highly trained assassin. He was also a highly trained anti-hijacking specialist, and he was a hostage rescue specialist as well, which meant that this guy knew what to do in a hijacking. He was trained as an anti-hijacking specialist. He knew what to do when he got on board as a hostage rescue specialist, which means he would know how all of the emergency equipment on board the aircraft worked, how to make a PA announcement to the passengers. Even he probably knew how to make one to the passengers and the cockpit, because there's a way you can do that too. And he knew how the cockpit door opened, where the key was kept, and all of the other emergency equipment that is easily accessed on the aircraft that a crew member or a hostage rescue person would know. So this man, by the way, is quite a hero in his Middle Eastern home country. There's even statues and monuments built to this man, as I've read. The problem is that he's not from an Islamic country. So I hate to burst your bubble if you're a Fox News viewer. He's also not Muslim. He's not even from an Arabic country. He's a special operations intelligence guy with an Israeli Defense Forces unit called the Sayeret Matkal. If you watch the show 24, he's the equivalent to Jack Bauer. So let that sink in for just a minute. This man was on board. What are the chances? Flight 11, the very first flight to be hijacked, trained as an anti-hijacking specialist, trained to kill people. And yet we are led to believe that he actually was killed by these guys sitting in the row behind him. So you're probably asking yourself this question, well, how is it? As I ask myself this, how is it that a special operations, highly trained assassin, a man trained to kill people, could possibly be sitting there and two 5'6", 20-year-old something or others, supposedly were planning what we now know has been planned years in advance as the new Pearl Harbor by the Project for the New American Century, and not do anything about it. Now, 9B, I went on to find out, actually grew up in Denver, Colorado. So he's an American that moved to Israel when he was 14 with his family, signed up as they have to for the IDF services in the military. And there they recognized his level of genius and put him in the special operations unit called the Sayeret Matkal and turned him into a highly trained assassin, a hostage rescue specialist. Now, just a little bit of trivia for you, so you know. Ehud Barak, who was the prime minister of Israel, was also in the Sayeret Matkal, and Bibi Netanyahu, who is the prime minister currently, also is a highly trained assassin and Sayeret Matkal. Now, there's a very small club, but what are the chances in the United States on September 11th we would have such a character on board? Especially when we have two flight attendants that referred to the hijacker as one he. Just think about that for a second, because this hit me over the head like a brick. As I continued to look at this, I read about this gentleman. Now, his friends in Israel said about him that this guy, 9B, he could kill any human being use a, using a pen and a credit card. Well, I actually saw that done on the show 24 by uh, one of their agents. And so, this guy was on a business trip, and so surely he had a pen with him and a credit card. And by the way, he was fluent in Arabic, English, and Hebrew. So while he's sitting there listening to these two guys supposedly in the row behind him, now remember for the last time you flew, I bet you overheard those people talking in the row right behind you because they're talking facing forward right at your ears, about 2 feet away. So here this guy is. He can hear and understand every word of the supposed Arab hijackers. And he does nothing about it. Well, so I keep looking into this, and I find out there's a group of people called the Project for a New American Century. It's actually a paper that was written. It's often referred to as PNAC. And if you read and you can Google search this online, it's real easy to do. If you can look at this project for the New American Century and look at all the people that signed that, one of the things they wrote in that project for New American Century was the need for a new Pearl Harbor. I'm not kidding you. A need for a new Pearl Harbor to rally the American people, that's us, you and me, around 7 pre-planned wars. By the way, this was written over a year before 9/11 took place. So I'm starting now to see that there are some things that are not quite like what I was shown by the media and that I read in everything I could get my hands on. So I went on to continue dissecting all the details of all of the phone calls, and I found so many anomalies and obvious signs that some of the callers, in fact, were being told what to say, that it absolutely was mind-blowing. And I continued this, and I started to write a chart because I started to see things that were the same exact words, as if maybe they were even shown cue cards or just told what to say. Maybe they wrote a note down. But the things that they said were abnormal because, as we said, when we are in a hijacking, of course, in the air. And almost everyone that called out said, "We've been hijacked. We're up in the air." Well, if you were hijacked and on the ground, you'd be being liberated because we know how to get you out of those doors, and we would have done that. So to say you're in the air just doesn't work. But almost all the callers were saying in the air, we're up in the air. And then another thing they said, they described these hijackers as they're of Middle Eastern descent. Well, that also includes 9B, because he's Israeli, right? Because they're of Middle Eastern descent. I don't know anyone who talks like that. Now, I have neighbors that are from a Middle Eastern country. I don't know for sure. I know one's from Saudi Arabia. I know that because of the women wearing their customary hijab cover and that sort of thing. But I still wouldn't say they're of Middle Eastern descent. I don't know that they had immigrated from someplace or in all my years of flying, especially coming out of Europe, I I would never have described someone that way because you can't tell someone from Iran or Turkey or other countries unless they're wearing their customary outfits. And these guys were wearing Western clothing according to the pictures they showed us. So I just kept on digging through all of these details, and what I found absolutely will well, it certainly blew me away, and it probably will you too when you realize what all was really, really, truly going on. Because of the timing of the phone calls and what the National Transportation Safety Board and the FAA were telling us, I started making all these complicated charts and putting the phone calls. Who made the calls? What were they saying? Were they saying they were on a rapid descent? Were they mentioning a landing or descending or anything like that? We all remember Flight 93. And Flight 93 is the one they even made a Hollywood movie about right afterwards. That's the one where the guy said, "Let's roll." And we were led to believe that the flight attendants just sat back and allowed passengers to take over in a hijack. Now I'm going to repeat what I told you earlier on. Every year, every flight attendant in the United States goes through a yearly training, and in that training, we review step by step the FAA hijacking protocols and the code words that we're to use when we talk to each other and the pilots and people on the ground. And the most important details that if we could talk to anyone on the ground, or if we talk to the pilots and we are their eyes and ears, we would want to tell them these important details. One, what kind of weapons they have. And so we're actually shown parts of a bomb, what they look like, the explosives and the initiator and all of the little pieces, and we're shown all the different kinds of weapons, guns, rifles, shotguns, and kind of so we have an idea what these weapons are. So when we tell the pilots, they can tell the ground, so the ground people know what kind of weapon they have on board. Well, the interesting thing about Flight 93, unlike the Hollywood movie, what I found about these guys is the gentlemen that they lead you and I to believe were the heroes of Flight 93, the Let's Roll character, and two or three others. Really, the official story never tells us how many. But all of the men that were mentioned were sitting on phone calls using their airphone or their cell phone or something at different rows in coach, not anywhere close to each other, talking to different people. One was talking to a phone operator from GTE. One was talking to his wife. And never they were on the phone for 13 to 15 minutes. They never time from the time of the hijacking starting till the time they did the let's roll, supposedly, to create a plan because they never spoke to each other. Now, at the let's roll plan, that was to take a meal cart or beverage cart and rush it down and use it as a battering ram to open the cockpit door this way, along with coffee pots of hot water, to get the cockpit back from the hijackers. That was the official story. Well, here's a problem with that. One, flight attendants would never allow you to do it because you don't know the code words, you don't know the procedures. And two, that box that sits between the captain and the co-pilot is the flight computer. We could not even pass a glass of water over that computer. To give the captain beverage, it had to go over his left shoulder, not over that box, because if we would have a China syndrome on our hands if just a little tablespoon of liquid went in there. So again, I saw that flight attendants, one, would not let passengers let's roll take over the cockpit, and two, they surely would never have allowed hot water in pots to be brought into the cockpit to douse that computer, because that's a surefire way to crash the plane. And so then as I kept reading through this scenario that was going on, I realized that this is an impossibility. What they were telling us was a really bad made for Hollywood movie. That they didn't even use anyone that had ever been trained in hijacking procedures as a consultant, or I wouldn't have caught them, because I did. They're not happy about it either, because this book in 7 months has hit number 9 in Amazon out of 8 million books. And the American people have shown me one thing. They're tired of being lied to by the media, by politicians, and everyone else. And they're ready to hear this truth. And they all knew. I have had thousands of people from your state in Utah, because I've been on 2 local radio places, shows there, Salt Lake and St. George area, that have told me they always knew there was no plane crash at the Pentagon or at Shanksville, and they were right. There weren't. Because what I continued to find was the methodology that was used to remotely control the aircraft and take them somewhere you don't even know. But I found out, you're going to read about it in the book, and how they did it and who covered it up. And unbeknownst to me, I was just as an American red, white, and blue apple pie as everyone else. I absolutely could not believe what I found, but I'm telling you, I'm here to tell you the truth. According to the FAA and the National Transportation Board, when that aircraft, Flight 93, was having those guys let's roll, push that meal cart, the coffee pots and the hot water on it into the cockpit door, that aircraft was coming out of the sky 6 to 10,000 feet per minute. Digest that for a second. They were also at a 40+ degree angle. Just think about that. Now, I was really good in the aisle with a coffee pot, but I wasn't that good. And they were also upside down. Now, those heroes, let's roll, they were a lot better than a 30-year flight attendant would say, because they were pushing a cart with hot water through a 25-inch narrow aisle. If you've ever been on a 757, it's one of the narrowest aisles of all the aircraft. If you're a little heavy, you have a hard time getting through that, and it's nearly impossible to roll your luggage down there unless you have a really tiny little carry-on luggage. And so what I saw when I put together the FAA and the National Transportation Safety Board documents along with those phone calls is that I was looking at a completely impossible situation and quite possibly a very, very, very poorly written Hollywood script. So what I discovered is that we as a nation have been completely hoodwinked. And what we thought happened on 9/11 is such a far cry from what really happened to the planes, the passengers, and the crew members that it will absolutely boggle your mind. Because it did mine, and I'm no different than you guys. I also discovered that what some of the people that we consider our closest allies and best friends in the Middle East are very much involved, not with just 9/11, not just Hollywood, not just the banking system, but they are also in control of most of our politicians that get sent to Washington, D.C. Now, I know just like you that I've heard all of those promises that they make us when they're running for election. And then I know what they do when they get back there. I think this last week when we saw that the trade deal that was kept hidden from all of us, you and me, some of the politicians that were interested went in and got to read, but they couldn't take notes. They couldn't take a camera. They couldn't take their cell phone in there. They couldn't take any recording devices in there either. And then they had to sign a pledge they'd never talk about it to you, the constituents. Imagine that. But that's where what happened. And we're going to find out, much like we did in the long-term effects of NAFTA, what really was in the TAP, TPP, and TPIP. There's actually 3 stages of this, but in short, we just put a crown on President Obama's head, and that crown will be passed on to Hillary Clinton. Let there be no doubt in your mind about that. No matter what we do, the game's pretty well rigged. Because you remember John F. Kennedy, he made a very compelling lecture, and he spoke about a secret society, didn't he? I'm sure most of you are old enough to recall that speech. These people, they literally control our federal agencies. I found things in the 9/11 details that I found in government agency paperwork and documents that prove that the FBI is covering this up. Because I'll bet none of you in that audience have ever heard the fact that there were at least 1, if not 2 women involved, not 19 hijackers. There were men that spoke perfect English, like maybe 9B might, because after all, he did grow up in Denver, Colorado. His wife, by the way, did have a heavy accent. But there were women involved, and I found that in FBI documents right before the book went into being put together. And I had to quickly add this information because I'm up all night reading an FBI document that I'd found from either the Zachariah Moussaoui trial or the 9/11 Commission report. It's just FBI documents that has been used. Some of it has not been used in both of those cases. But our media is extremely controlled. So you can no longer trust that you're being told on the news what's real and what's not. Because I know just like you, I truly sat 10 days straight, nearly 20 hours a day, and I watched and I listened to everything that took place on 9/11 in those 10 days afterwards, because I had to go back to work and get back in a plane. And I was devastated as an American to find out that NORAD took well over an hour and 20 minutes to scramble any jets to help any of those passengers. And I was about to have to go back to work and face those passengers knowing that they didn't have, nor did I have, a safety net that I'd been told for 30 years existed called NORAD, Strategic Air Command, the alert jets, the U.S. military. Because some guy with a satellite phone and laptop living in a cave in Afghanistan had control of them somehow. So, what I found out in all of the research is that something has happened to our country, in case you haven't noticed. It's not at all like what our founding fathers set out to create now, is it? We've had a silent coup, just like Kennedy warned us. It's taken place right in front of our eyes, and since they control all of the information, magazine, newspaper, movies, everything is filled with their message, their agenda, their brainwashing, along with the CIA, to keep our wars going and to keep us giving up our children and our grandchildren to fight those wars for them. This is not the country that most of us were raised to love and fight for. Many of us have lost family members in the Iraq and Afghanistan war. And let me point out to you this, because this is something that always struck me as odd. Of the fake 9/11 supposed hijackers, not one of them was from Iraq or Afghanistan. They were from Saudi, Oman, and Yemen only. So why did we go to Iraq anyway? And why did we go to Afghanistan? I know people that were in Afghanistan 3 days after 9/11. One of them actually made it into my novel. That's a true story, just changed his name to protect him from our government. Now, did you ever think that you could be like me, that I found all this information and that I wrote a book and I had to write it as a novel in hopes that I wouldn't be a drone strike and killed by my own government? That should be a reality check for each and every one of us to realize how much trouble our nation is in right now. You'll remember that as soon as 9/11 happened, immediately, nearly immediately, I believe it was within 3 weeks, the Patriot Act was signed. And I actually recently have a friend who I spoke to was the second person after Jose Padilla, Susan Lindauer. She was working along with the CIA as a liaison between Iraq and some people in the United Nations. She was actually picked up under the Patriot Act. She was arrested, and the words they said were, "You're arrested under the Patriot Act." That woman was thrown in military prison, and fortunately for her, she had an uncle that was an attorney that was a pit bull, and he fought and fought and fought till he found her and got her out. She easily, had she just been a couple years later, she could have been picked up on the NDAA. And if you don't know what that is, you better look it up. Because after the Patriot Act, they put in the NDAA. It's every year renewed, like a driver's license. And in that NDAA, that label terrorist, insurgent, whatever they want to call you, bad guy, enemy of the state, can be put on you for your religion. Now, if most of you are LDS, I've studied some LDS history because I actually I'm working on a novel in my head that's pulling in some LDS history. So, you know that the United States government, from your own history, can be pretty darn ruthless. And if they decide, because of plural marriage or of your doctrine, that they want you dead, they can put out an order right on your head and kill you, much like the NDA allows them to do to anyone for any reason in this country now. You can become a terrorist if you are in a religion or a thought process that they feel that they're threatened by, including writing a novel. So it's really interesting. And for those of you that are LDS, one of friends has has brought this to my attention because it seems like history is repeating itself. We've just seen this gay marriage come up, and we've seen our politicians not listening to us when we don't want the TPA, the TPP, the TIP, whatever that trade agreement has been labeled in any of the process of all that secretive voting. And they're not listening to us, none of them. I know the Utah guys all went right along with it, even though I'm sure you thought they were conservative and that they loved their country and they loved America and Americans. And we'd like to keep our jobs. But unfortunately, they get back to Washington, D.C., they don't work for us anymore. But as we were talking the other day about history repeating itself, and I believe it's in Helaman 5, where it says, they who choose evil were more numerous than they who chose good. And let that digest for just a second, because that's where we are as a nation right now. And one of the things that I found out about this faked terror attack of 9/11 is who was involved in it. All the government agencies that either were involved or were complicit and turned their head the other way and allowed it to take place. And then all of them and the media who have chanted over and over and over again, and keep your own history in your mind, because they are labeling people for their religion as a terrorist. And we want to kill those people over and over, much like the Mormon history. When the government decided that they were going to put a price tag on your head, and an extermination order, basically, is what we have for these Muslims in the Middle East, all set on a card, an illusion. It isn't what you thought and even what you think. And that's one reason on the media you're going to hear over and over and over the 9/11 terror attacks. They will say that. If you listen, you'll hear it 5 or 10 times an hour. It doesn't matter if it's Fox or CNN, cable news, you're going to hear it chanted over and over and over again. They don't want you to ever forget, because you are being brainwashed. So one of the things I learned in looking into this, I went really, really deep, and I followed up on what Kennedy was talking about. Some other politicians that woke up to this, and as a consequence, were assassinated for opening their mouths and saying what they saw. And what about these secret societies? So what I found out is, you'll all remember when George H.W. Bush mentioned this very kindly in his speech, the New World Order. Well, the New World Order, it sounded so sweet when he said it. I remember plain as day when he said it, about 11 years before 9/11 happened. And it didn't sound bad at all to me. But the New World Order is global tyranny. It's a one world government referred to in the Bible. I'm sure you'll recall that. The New World Order, the one world order, is what you see in progress right now. 9/11 was just moving the ball along. It brought us the Patriot Act. It brought us airport security. Keep in mind, there were not 19 airplanes on the real passenger manifest on those 4 planes on 9/11. There were not one Arab passenger on board the real passenger manifest. The FBI created fake passenger manifests. They showed them to us, and unbeknownst to them, they picked 4 people initially, and you probably don't even know this because I didn't, and I was watching really closely. They picked 4 people. 3 of them showed up alive. One of them was an FAA aviation safety employee in Florida, and another one had died a year earlier in a plane crash. And so they quickly replaced those 4 that they claimed were on the passenger manifest with 4 other people. And maybe that's where the Saudi pilots showed up, and they just grabbed names and identities and photographs. Because some of those people in Saudi Arabia have never been to the United States. One gentleman that was accused of being on Flight 93 said he didn't even know what a Pennsylvania was. And he was supposed to be flying the plane that went into Shanksville. So what I discovered is that there's much more. I wrote this in the book. I actually found a plan, and I refer to it as the nuclear 9/11. There's another plan in store for us, and we are one event, especially during this summer with Jade Helm 15 in progress. We are one event away from being under a total police state and complete and total martial law. That's one of the things that I discovered as I continued digging into the people behind 9/11, behind perpetrating the lie that they're continuing, and behind the 7 planned wars and the signers of the Project for a New American Century, PNAC as it's called. Those are the people who wrote the need to rally us. Do you know what that means? That means they hoodwinked us with this 9/11 illusion so that we could rally behind a flag. And you'll remember those flags that unfurled right away. They were hanging on every building in every town in this country. So the flag manufacturers made a fortune, and so did those that sold those flags because they were everywhere. Because they turned it into like a Super Bowl. We had to pick our team. Even George Bush said to us, "You're either with us or you're with the terrorists." Well, none of us wanted to be terrorists now, did we? So we quickly stood there in line just like he wanted us to do. But we are so close right now. One of the things you need to also understand is during 9/11, FEMA was having a drill that morning scheduled. Also, the NRO, the National Geospatial Organization, are the people that run all of our satellite technology. They were actually drilling that an airplane was flown into their building, and they're not too far from Dulles Airport. Now, there were several military war games going on that day also, and those drills also included hijacked airplanes. So when Boston Air Traffic Control called in to the northeast sector of NORAD called NEADS and said, "We've got a hijacking. We have a hijacking." They said, "Is this real or is it part of the war game?" And that caused these delays to happen because people thought this was the drill. Now, just in case you don't know this, in London on the 7/7 bombings, there was an ongoing drill also. And just so happens that Bibi Netanyahu was also in town that day for them. So we didn't have Bibi Netanyahu, but we did have Ehud Barak in town the night before September 11th in New York City on the morning of September 11th. Now remember, he was a special operations Sayeret Matkal, trained assassin. He was in New York the night of September 10th. He was in the BBC studios. As a matter of fact, he's the man who coined the phrase war on terror and told us we needed to go after Osama bin Laden and create this war on terror. That's where the saying war on terror came from. A Sayeret Matkal special operations trained assassin, just like we had sitting in 9B on Flight 11. It's pretty amazing to me. I don't know. But what I discovered is that the same group of people behind 9/11 through a back door in the old Promise Inslaws computer software control our biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons, our nuclear reactors, and all of the security around the facilities that hold those things. So if they want to pull off an attack, like I read about in an Israeli newspaper, a couple of years ago, I was actually driving through your state somewhere on the way to Idaho, and I was reading this to my husband out loud, thankfully, because it was scrubbed off the internet. But what this article said was the Israeli intelligence had intercepted Al Qaeda's plan to attack 5 or 6 major cities in the United States using biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons. Well, I already knew what I knew from studying 9/11 and all the people involved and how our national security has been so compromised by the same people that lobby and control all of our politicians. And I thought, well, that's really odd. I was just reading the Drudge Report and CNN and Fox News. I didn't see anything about this on any news sites. I went back and read them all, and there was not one mention of that attack. Now, if 5 or 6 major cities are attacked using biological, chemical, and nuclear warheads in this country, don't you think that's news? More important than Kim Kardashian's rear end? I thought so. So I thought, well, that's really odd. But do you understand what would happen if July 4th, tomorrow, next day, or sometime during Jade Helm, that there were 5 or 6 major cities attacked using biological, chemical, and nuclear warheads? You wouldn't have to worry about running anyone for president in an election. We would have a crown on Mr. King Obama for a long time to come, because everything would come to a screeching halt and our nation would be gone as we know it. This is a very serious message. So what I like to end this with is that both political parties are completely under that control, and that everyone in this country needs to prepare, because these drills, much like Jade Helm, FEMA drills, the ongoing war games on 9/11, have a tendency to go live. And it causes a great deal of confusion for first responders because they think it's a drill. Now, I was a firefighter and a first responder, an EMT, and an EMT instructor. So I know what drills are like. I've been the patient, I've been the instructor, and I've been the student learning on all those drills. I've drilled as a firefighter. I know what drilling's all about. In the airline, we drilled all the time for hijacking, for ditchings, like the guy that landed on the Hudson River. So I know drills. And if it goes live during a drill, there's a great deal, as we saw in 9/11. One of the reasons NORAD didn't ever scramble and save those people is because nobody knew if it was real or a drill, because there's so many drills. There were 20 some drills going on. The FBI was drilling on the West Coast. I believe it was in the Bay Area. So they were completely out of the East Coast, so they weren't even involved. But they were the most senior FBI people that were involved in that drill. So they had a hard time getting back to New York and DC to take a look. By the time they got back there, most of the pieces of that missile that hit the Pentagon were picked up. You remember looking at those people walking shoulder to shoulder, looking like they're looking for a lost contact lens? That's not what a 757 crash would look like in front of the Pentagon. So I'm going to just close, and I know I've got just a couple minutes here, and I just want to give you this message. If you haven't read Methodical Illusion, I invite you to read it. I'm working on a sequel that'll come out in August with even deeper information. Prepare yourselves and your family for anything. I like to tell people, and I do instruct people how to do this preparation. Prepare for an EMP attack. And if you don't know how to do that, the best way is to unplug your house from electricity for a weekend and see what it will be like living without electronics. So if you have an electronic shaver, you better go get some handheld razor blades. Those kind of things. How will you cook? How will you feed your family? Will your toilet work or not? Are you on a sewer system? Will you have fresh water? And get yourselves as ready as you can emotionally, spiritually, and physically with your water, your medicine, and that sort of thing, so that you can be the person that you're meant to be, or you wouldn't be hearing this message. So those of you in this room, the message is for you. You will be the next leaders of this country, because not everybody's going to make it through their next plan. So I just can't stress enough that you know what to do, that you are prepared. And during these months of Jade Helm, from July 15th until September 15th, you want to get yourselves as prepared as soon as possible for anything. And if you prepare for an EMP and it's something lesser than that, then you're going to be prepared for whatever they dish out. Because you need to be enough prepared that you can tell your friends and family and people that might think you're a crazy preparedness freak that you knew all along this was coming, because you do. You have to know this. You have got to have seen the changes in this country that I've seen, and that you have to know that we are very much in danger of losing every single solitary freedom we ever thought we had, because the Patriot Act took a lot of them. Just go to an airport and try to go somewhere. If you think that, remember what it was like in 1975. Go to a football game, see what happens. You get patted down to go to a federal building. Same thing. You're an American. You don't need to be patted down. You're not a terrorist. Why are they treating you like that? That's how they treated us as flight crew members after 9/11. We had our toothpaste tubes squeezed out. We had our lotions all squeezed out by these uh, people that they hired to make it look like we had security, all on an illusion. What really happened on 9/11, you won't even believe what you read, but it is the God's truth. Or I wouldn't have put it in print, and I wouldn't be giving you this message. And this message is you must be aware and awake what is going on, who's doing this, and if things go sideways this summer or next year, that you are prepared emotionally, spiritually, and physically with your food, your water, any kind of medicines that you might need, and keep that stuff as maxed out as possible, because just because you're prepared doesn't mean your neighbor will be. And you will be the pillar of strength for your family and your neighborhood and your friends and the guy down the street that didn't know this might have a chance of happening. But we're about to lose our country, so I appreciate you guys starting a new party. And I'll do anything I can do to help support that, because the other two parties are just one. So, my time is up.
Rebecca, this is Wayne, and I, the one that got you to come, and I just really want to thank you. And I gave the first speech this morning on, or presentation on Jekyll Island, and to me, I said that I promised I will never vote for another Republican, another Democrat, ever. And I go a little further than anybody else. I say I won't even do it in a local level, because if they have that R or D behind their name, they've already sold out. That's my opinion. But anyway, will you run for president in the Independent American Party? That's all right, anybody for that?
Well, one of the things you guys will want to have is a copy of the Methodical Illusion, because the last chapter is the State of the Union address from the president in the book, named Joel Sherman, because President Obama and Vice President Biden in chapter 1 have been busted selling arms in Benghazi to the Syrian rebels and have been impeached. So Joel Sherman becomes the president. And the State of the Union speech is the last chapter, and everyone that reads that has their heart on this country, calls me or emails me and says, "Where is Joel Sherman?" Because he's what we need in this country. And so if you haven't read Methodical Illusion, on that right there, you'll want to have a copy of his speech.
Well, we certainly will. And again, thank you very much. And you know what? You'll never have to worry about speaking in the Republican or Democratic Party. They will never let you speak. You always have a home here, Ken.
Thank you so much.